We had men and women on the ground, Albanian men and women, being cleared out of their homes, families fleeing to the forests. Naturally, there was a great desire on the part of the political leadership to go after those forces that were directly involved in perpetrating these atrocities.
Tony Blair went to NATO headquarters shocked at the sense of drift that now prevailed.
Good morning, everyone.
He wanted the army in Kosovo hit and NATO's PR sharpened up.
I certainly believe that we had to take a grip on the whole way the thing was run and organized, because it was it wasn't just a military campaign, it was also a propaganda campaign. And we had to take our public opinions with us. You know, you had a NATO alliance, a bureaucracy that simply wasn't tuned up. Organizing it was a problem. And I felt a bit like, you know, at the beginning of a big political campaign where, you know, your officials were all assembled in different places and no one had ever quite done anything like this before.
I think the pressure on General Clark was absolutely intense from the political leadership of the alliance. There was a moral imperative to be seen to attack the Third Army in Kosovo, to respond, quite frankly, to public pressure to be bombing those forces that were committing the atrocities.
The moral purpose was very simple. A gross injustice had been done to people right on the doorstep of the European Union, which we were in a position to prevent and reverse.
I don't wish to be impertinent, but I don't think most of our civilian leadership generally understands air power and how it should be employed. Their exposure to it has been films of the Gulf War, which look much like a video game, and what they were seeing on television with ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, streams of refugees being forced out of their homes.
What the politicians wanted was very clear.
Splash, DP-25.
But the pilots could not deliver it.
There is cloud in the area, but you may be able to get the drop in. Knowledge, trying to work round.
We were flying every day or every night. We were flying missions, and yet you knew that there were still, you know, refugees pouring out. There were still horrendous stories of what was going on the ground in Kosovo, and while we were doing everything we could, and that, you know, the NATO campaign was going on, we weren't actually stopping it happen. You know, the Serbs weren't leaving, and that was painful. You know, you get back to your hotel at night and you watch the news, and you know, you knew you were doing everything you could, but it was still going on. So that hurt sometimes.
At 15,000 feet, NATO's pilots were safe, but so were the Serb forces they were trying to find. General Pavkovic commanded the Third Army in Kosovo. This was not an army on the run. It was calm, defiant, and secure.
The Serbs dictated the pace of events. They dictated the battle rhythm. They came out to burn villages when they wanted to. They hid when the weather was good. His troops had dispersed. His command and control capability was out in the field in tents or bunkered or under the trees, wherever they needed to be.
Pa mi smo naravno primjenjivali te mere obmanjivanja, maskiranja, obmanjivanja i imali smo veliki broj lažnih ciljeva koje su bili praktično poturani NATO avijaci. I najviše su uništili takvih ciljeva.
It was Kosovo's guerrilla fighters that took to flight. Lirak Chelai's unit found itself isolated and vulnerable. They were mystified that their mighty enemy seemed unaffected by NATO action. They struggled and failed to protect fleeing civilians against retribution.
I have some pictures which I shot them with camera that I had. I will never forget these pictures. People which didn't have enough to eat, people who are sleeping in the car, and I saw children suffering. We decided to organize them in a big convoy to send them to Pristina. It was very sad to let your people to go in the Serbs' hand. We couldn't protect them anymore.
The end of the convoy was too slow. Serb paramilitaries surrounded it near the town of Koljic.
I remember my father was so afraid. He said to us, "Oh my God, what I have done."
When the Serbs arrived in Koljic, they already found the Somalian because the convoy was too long.
The paramilitary forces have separated us, and they want to execute all my family. And my father paid 1,000 Deutschmark to rescue us.
Those who couldn't pay were not spared. Dozens, perhaps as many as 80, were murdered. The aftermath of this atrocity was caught on camera. How many others were not?
We send our reports every night of Serb position on headquarters, and they were supposed to pass it to NATO. They were all out in the field. It was, I think, very easy to attack this, but they never did it.
The mismatch between real military achievement and the resolute confidence of the politicians was clear.
Day and night regularity of pounding is already having an effect, is severely depleting their capability of carrying on this violence. They are being hurt very badly on the military front.
There is no doubt at all it has been hugely inhibited, his policy of ethnic cleansing, and as a result of the destruction of his air defense systems, his military infrastructure, his supplies, we are, of course, halting that machine, and there is no doubt.
We weren't really having a fairly devastating effect at that time, were we?
Well, it is true that in terms of what he was able to do in Kosovo, we were hindering him rather than stopping him, at least in the initial stages. And that was because of the limitations of that type of military action.
So those we didn't destroy, we degraded their operations. I think it had a huge impact on their army.
What impact did that strategy have on his ability to carry out ethnic cleansing?
I don't think it impacted him at all. Clearly, all the targets that we struck, at least in my mind clearly, that we struck in Kosovo, he had evacuated long before.
The pilots found these small mobile targets so hard to find that on some days they dropped half their bombs on so-called dump sites known to be empty. The head of the air campaign himself so despaired of being forced to chase such elusive targets that he considered resigning.
As any human being dealing with that frustration, there were a couple of times when I thought, I can't do this anymore. I don't believe that we're doing this right, and I owe it to my people to stand up and say we're not doing this right.
Short believed there was an alternative. He wanted to go outside Kosovo and hit major strategic targets that would directly hurt the Milosevic regime. He pressed the political leaders to let him do it.
Their reaction was we needed to strike at those troops that were committing the atrocities. That's an understandable reaction. I believe our military reaction should have been, no, Mr. Prime Minister or Mr. President or Mr. Chancellor, we need to strike at Milosevic. You need to give me permission to do that tonight.
To the people of Serbia, NATO's war came out of the blue. They were told nothing about atrocities in Kosovo. Milosevic told them NATO's campaign was an unprovoked war against ordinary Serb people.
U ovom trenutku, kada smo izloženi I opasnosti od napada NATO pakta, svi građani doprineće odbrani zemlje. Radio televizije Srbije.
Serbian radio and television played to the worst fears of a paranoid population. Day and night it evoked the horrors of the 1940s, when Nazi Germany occupied Yugoslavia. Belgrade itself had not yet been bombed. That was about to change.
We talked about the need to move into targeting facilities, command and control facilities in Belgrade. After all, this is where the ethnic cleansing was being driven. This is the central headquarters of the Interior Ministry there, and there was no reason why we shouldn't be striking it.
Bombing Belgrade meant moving to phase 3 of the air campaign, a dramatic escalation. Could the consensus at NATO hold together? The question was expertly sidestepped. The North Atlantic Council was never asked to give its approval. The decision was made by the Secretary General and his top military advisor.
Phase 3 could have been seen as an all-out air war against Yugoslavia. And the NATO nations, or not all NATO nations, were prepared to go as far. And for that reason, we never took the risk to ask the question, knowing that we may run into some problems.
That all-out war came to Belgrade on April the 3rd, day 11. NATO hit the Interior Ministry, the campaign headquarters of Kosovo's ethnic cleansers. For the head of the air campaign, the real war had finally begun, but it was to prove a false start.
We were going to Belgrade. Belgrade was in flames. We had attacked the proper target set. The issue from that point on was to stay after it, and we had some difficulty doing that.
That difficulty came from France. Paris claimed not to have been consulted. President Chirac was furious to learn of the attack only afterwards. He and his foreign minister determined that they would be consulted from now on.
Nous avons pensé que les autorités politiques devaient intervenir à nouveau, d'une part quand il fallait changer de phase. Changer de phase, ça veut dire changer de cible.
A French general moved into Clark's office to scrutinize the targets in advance.
I had a French two-star that stayed there with us the whole time, who came out to my house virtually every night, and we talked about progress, and he liaised for me.
These new tensions in the alliance were made worse by Belgrade's response. Far from being cowed, the population of the city rallied. They consciously taunted NATO, testing its nerve.
For strategic reasons, and quite frankly, for signal reasons, I wanted to strike what has become called the rock and roll bridge. The bridge that the Serbs were dancing on early in the campaign to demonstrate their defiance. I wanted to bring that bridge down. And by one country, we were denied the ability to strike that bridge. And in fact, what was relayed to me was that the leadership of that country had said, "Don't even ask."
Which country?
It was France.
Qu'il fallait éviter au maximum tout ce qui concernait d'une façon plus générale la vie économique du pays, donc la vie des gens, et la vie des gens sur le plan le plus concret.
I never had anything but the greatest support, and, both moral and material, from the French Air Force. I cannot begin to offer opinions on why their government made the decision that they did.
They made those decisions because they knew that a major targeting error downtown could cause so many casualties that public support for NATO would ebb away. In Belgrade, as in the West, public opinion was a weapon. Radio Television Serbia, RTS, transmitted anti-NATO propaganda day and night.
We and our NATO allies have taken this action only after extensive and repeated efforts to obtain a peaceful solution to the crisis in Kosovo.
In Kosovo are asking for the chance to live free from fear. We have in our power the means to help them secure justice.
Ruling the world is not an easy task, especially for a housewife. Problems are piling up, but don't despair. The universally famous Made-in-Bill world cleaners have a perfect solution, which offers the best resolution. Tested in Yugoslavia for the first
Nations
time
begin to
ever.
ask us in the region, said, please get rid of Serb television. I mean, it's just a huge propaganda weapon for Milosevic. It's the way he maintains command and control. It's a legitimate military target. You need to disable this. And so we looked at a number of different techniques that could have been used to disable it. We finally concluded the best way to do it was to bomb it.
RTS pictures were beamed around the world. Western television journalists in Belgrade used them too.
CNN's Alessio Vinci is there. Alessio?
Serbian television reported that the bombing, heavy bombing, went on all night.
The American network CNN was based in the RTS building itself.
6:30 a.m. Belgrade time.
We start talking to our colleagues in Atlanta, to some contacts again in Washington and in Brussels, and we heard more and more that the RTS was coming up on the target list.
Nešto pre 2 ponoći više projektila zločinačke soldateske palo je na naselje u samom gradu.
When these pictures hit Western television screens, they became a real threat to NATO's ability to sustain the war. Whenever NATO made mistakes, Western journalists were taken to film civilian casualties. At Jakovica, the Allies bombed a convoy of Albanian refugees, wrongly believing it to be a Serbian military column. RTS pictures had an impact around the world.
We also heard from sources in Brussels and in Washington that there was a lot of people who were unhappy with the way RTS was broadcasting their own part of the story. It was also a time when NATO started making the first mistakes, hitting civilian areas, and RTS was obviously prominently showing that. They would concentrate 99.9% of their coverage on the mistakes, or so-called mistakes, that NATO would do. And of course we were using those pictures because they were the only pictures that we had available.
This is one of the problems about waging a conflict in a modern communications and news world. We were aware that there would be pictures coming back. The convoys were, in many ways, the worst of refugees that were hit by NATO bombs. We were aware that those pictures would come back, and there would be an instinctive sympathy for the victims of the campaign.
RTS journalists openly taunted the West.
Neka Clark puca, mi ga čekamo. Obaveštavamo ga da smo u Takovskoj 10. Da baš ne kažem na kom stepenu geografske širine i azimutu, neka to sam pronađe.
And then at some point we were told that it was better to just leave the building altogether because the risk of staying there, even during the day, was too high because NATO had started 24-hour bombing, and that there was no way to find out when exactly RTS may get bombed.
Although the foreign journalists had pulled out, local technicians continued to work their night shifts. Ksenia Bankovic was among them. She believed that if the building was to be bombed, the RTS bosses would warn the staff in advance.
Ali nije se bojala da ide da radi I da bude na televiziji. Smatrala je da je tamo sigurna da radi. I rekla je, mama, ja idem. Ja sam je pogledala I rekla sam, dobro, čuvaj se. Ona je rekla, hoću, čuvat ću se, šetat ću.
At 6 minutes past 2 on the morning of April the 23rd, NATO did indeed target 10 Tarkovska Street. RTS was broadcasting a pre-recorded interview with Milosevic. Ksenia's mother rushed to the bombed building. No one from the RTS management offered help or information.
Da sam uznemirena iz bezumljenog pogleda koji straši po toj masi. Prilazili su mi I pitali su me, gospođo, je li vama neko noćas radio? Kažem, da, radila mi je čerka.
Ksenia Bankovic and 15 others, mostly technicians, died. When Belgrade woke the next morning, RTS was triumphantly back on the air. They were rerunning the interrupted Milosevic interview. RTS had made a contingency plan in the event of bombing. It did not include evacuating their own staff.
One can only wonder why those technicians and why those people were kept there, especially at night, when everybody at that time, especially so late into the war, knew that RTS was going to be a target.
I tvrdim da su bili žrtvovani. Zarad čega, ne znam. Taj odgovor morate da tražite na drugoj strani.
Na kojoj strani?
Pa na drugoj strani pre svega od ljudi iz televizije. Verovatno I od ljudi iz vlasti, možda savezne, možda republičke. Ne znam.
To what end did Ksenia Bankovic die? Her family believes she was deliberately sacrificed by the Serbian regime, for whom civilian deaths produced valuable propaganda. NATO derived no benefit at all from the bombing.
We knew that when we struck it, that there would be alternate means of getting the Serb television. There's no single switch to turn off everything. But we thought it was a good move to strike it, and the political leadership agreed with us.
They could have moved those people out of the building. They knew it was a target, and they didn't. And I think that was probably for, you know, very clear propaganda reasons. But there's no point. I mean, there's no way of waging war in a pretty way. It's ugly. It's an ugly business.
To je vandalizam. To možete, ja ne mogu da napadam ove, a da kažem NATO je u redu. NATO je moje dete ubio, a ovi su saučesnici, ali ubica je NATO.
It is an inherent weakness when democracies go to war. Western publics must confront the innocent suffering inflicted in their name.
If we allowed this butcher, murderer, and dictator to defeat the most powerful alliance on the face of the earth, because we didn't have the stomach for collateral damage, and we didn't have the stomach for unintended loss of civilian life, that we were going to cease to exist as an alliance.
Public opinion in the West grew more sensitive as the bombing campaign was stepped up. How far could public support be pushed? When NATO struck the Chinese embassy, mistakenly they claim, the politicians again reined in the military. They imposed a 5-mile no-bomb zone around Belgrade.
Je crois que le contrôle politique a finalement été maintenu de façon correcte, mais je crois aussi que c'est en grande partie grâce à nous, enfin grâce à la France.
A nation clearly had the ability to say, no one can strike that target. Not just us, not just you, no one can strike that target set. And what their motivation was in making that decision, certainly no one ever shared with me.
My military colleagues have got to understand that there will be political interest in which targets are struck, and that we want political approval for these politically sensitive targets.
Some American stealth bombers flew missions directly from bases inside the United States. The French government accused the Americans of flying unilateral bombing raids of their own outside the NATO command structure.
Tous les pays de l'Alliance Atlantique ont agi dans le cadre de l'OTAN, avec une coordination, une discussion sur les cibles, mais les États-Unis ont eu une action américaine en plus. C'était des moyens nationaux, avec une décision nationale commandée depuis les États-Unis, et les alliés européens ne connaissaient pas les autres actions.
With all due respect to the French foreign minister, that's incorrect.
Why would he say it?
It's incorrect. I'm not going to speculate on his motives. I can simply tell you it's not correct. I commanded all assets, and all assets were integrated into the NATO plan.
NATO unity itself was under growing strain. For America, the legacy of Vietnam is a simple rule. Put crudely, no body bags. But as the air war dragged on, Britain began to press America to plan for a possible ground invasion. The problem was, Clinton had ruled it out on the very first night.
If NATO is invited to do so, our troops should take part in that mission to keep the peace. But I do not intend to put our troops in Kosovo to fight a war.
Sandy Berger had put that sentence in the president's speech.
Had there been, at the beginning, a debate about ground forces, we would have started this campaign not with a solid NATO facing Milosevic. We would have started this campaign with a NATO with guns pointed at each other.
NATO had sent 12,000 troops to neighboring Macedonia to go into Kosovo only once Milosevic had agreed to a peace deal. Britain now argued that they could be turned into a ground invasion force.
I became convinced that we had to have that option there, and became convinced even more so once I'd visited NATO and sat down and talked to the guys who were fighting the campaign.
Blair's intervention had redefined the political aims of the war. They were blunt. Serbs out, NATO in, refugees home. He now wanted to redefine the means to achieve those aims.
You had to prepare for all contingencies, which was a euphemism for making sure that you had the ground force option there if you needed it.
There was certainly irritation at the very public way the British government was pushing the ground troops issue. It was interesting, especially because the kind of option that was a serious option meant they were pushing essentially for the deployment of American ground troops.
When people used to say to me occasionally, well, for goodness sake, Tony, just don't talk about it at all, I'd say, look, it's quite difficult. I mean, you're out there and people ask you. And as I say, we don't have Milosevic as media, and jolly good thing that we don't, but the fact is my guys ask me, and your guys ask you, and you're expected to have some sort of answer to this.
In April, the Allies gathered in Washington for NATO's 50th anniversary summit. The issue threatened to expose NATO as weak and divided. The Americans told the British bluntly to stop talking about it in public.
We meet at a time of crisis in Kosovo.
Clinton told Blair that NATO would not be allowed to lose. Blair took this to mean that US troops would be committed if needed.
I was never in any doubt that they would do what is right. America does do what is right. In the end, the president would have taken the decision necessary to make sure this thing was seen through.
But in the Pentagon, there was intense opposition. When General Clark took a ground invasion plan to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he was cold-shouldered.
I showed them the assessment that we'd made. They weren't actually the plans, they were the assessment of how an operation such as this might be done.
What he had at that time was somewhat analogous to having the sports section out of the entire Sunday newspaper that you'd normally anticipate in a military plan.
They were very appreciative of receiving the information. I didn't ask for a decision, so they didn't make a decision.
That was not sufficient to allow us to make a strong recommendation to the political leadership as to whether or not we should be undertaking a ground option.
The American military was closing off Blair's ground option. Instead, the alliance stepped up the bombing campaign. The power grid was struck, cutting off the electricity. The targets were no longer purely military.
The impact that it has on the leadership cadre around Milosevic, I think, is extreme.
But the leadership cadre stayed calm. They believed that the heavier the bombing, the greater the chance that the alliance would crack. And that danger was real. This was militarily effective, but politically risky. Some of the European allies believed they could not carry public opinion with them much longer.
It was not easy for Germany. This country was particularly interested in getting the war ended. There was a possibility that the crisis could evolve in a way that was could end up in a tragedy.
NATO now turned to an old adversary for help. The Russian envoy, Viktor Chernomyrdin, opened a new diplomatic channel with his US and European counterparts. He saw it as an admission of NATO's growing desperation.
То шли поиски. Начинал понимать, что дело там, и там бы не кончилось ни 2, ни 3 месяцами.
But it was not Chernomyrdin that mattered to Belgrade. Milosevic believed he had allies in the powerful Russian security elite, the military, the secret police, and the successor to the KGB. They thought NATO was out of control.
НАТО во главе с Соединенными Штатами нарушили те принципы и нормы международного права, международной жизни, которые действовали после Второй мировой войны.
Chernomyrdin represented, so to speak, the government, President Yeltsin, but to Milosevic, whose conception of power and whose relationship with the security forces was of a very special nature. It was extremely important that the security part of the Russian power structure said the same. In fact, said even more.
Russia's security forces cooperated with Germany to open a secret back channel to Milosevic himself. It relied on the connections of an inconspicuous Swedish financier called Peter Kastenfeld. Kastenfeld went to Moscow to meet the security forces. What he was told there would be crucial in bringing the war to an end.
Peter Kastenfeld, having given advice to the Russian government, including Yeltsin, had the full trust of the Russian leadership and the intelligence and security side there. He then waited for a signal. The signal came. The Russian Secret Service took him to the border, and there the Yugoslavs were waiting, and a car was there, and avoiding the bombs took him into Belgrade, where he then met Milosevic.
For 4 days, Kastenfeld held a series of secret meetings with Milosevic. He delivered a message that ended the Serbian leader's dreams of a Russian intervention. The Russian government was about to agree a peace plan with NATO, and the Russian security forces had accepted it.
It is, so to speak, a message that he would take more seriously than any other message from the Russians, because those were the people that formed the power apparatus around him. The security apparatus in Moscow said, end the war, or here are some conditions that look acceptable to us, and we cannot help you beyond it. So, exit now.
The official international envoy was now the Finnish President Martti Ahtisaari. He went to Belgrade with Chernomyrdin, carrying the joint NATO-Russian peace plan.
Both he and I didn't believe for a moment that we could get an agreement in Belgrade. We drove through the city. First of all, the city didn't look so damaged as one might have thought. We went to the guest house where he was waiting, and he looked like I would have met him yesterday. He took politely us, and we decided to go straight to the negotiating table. I actually read the peace offer, and he said, can we have a copy? They got it, and then they asked me if they could start improving the proposal. I said, unfortunately not. This is as good as we can come up with, and if we can't agree on this, the next offer will be worse than this, from your point of view.
NATO had agreed 2 key compromises.
For them, I think important points were that this whole thing would happen under UN auspices, and secondly, that Kosovo would remain part of Yugoslavia.
That made the deal acceptable to the Russians. It also gave Milosevic something that had not been on offer before the bombing started, a UN mandate.
There was a sort of sigh of relief, and I congratulated Chernomyrdin and hugged him in a brotherly fashion.
But the relief was premature. The Russian military had expected their own sector of Kosovo, independent of NATO. They now felt double-crossed.
Я чувствовал себя тоже как побежденный. Вот у меня такое ощущение было, именно как побежденный. Я ощущал, что зло побеждает добро.
They decided to try to take what they'd been denied. Russian troops stationed in Bosnia rolled towards Kosovo.
They had informally conveyed information that they might be an advance party for an airborne operation that would go into Pristina Airfield and potentially partition the country.
The question was, could they be stopped?
I called Secretary General and told him what the circumstances were. We talked about what the risks were and what might happen if the Russians got there. He said, of course you have to get to the airport. And I said, do you consider that I have the authority to do this? Of course you do. You have transfer of authority.
There was a way to stop the Russians. In a Macedonian cornfield, Clark put 500 British and French paratroopers on immediate standby to launch an airborne assault. But Clark's British subordinate told him the plan risked sparking World War III.
We were standing into a possibility, let me put it no more strongly than that, a possibility of confrontation with the Russian contingent, which seemed to me probably not the right way to start off a relationship with Russians who were going to become part of my command.
British and French objections thwarted Clark's plans. The 200 Russian troops passed through Kosovo and were greeted as liberating heroes by local Serbs. They took the airport unopposed. The world watched nervously. The Russians were planning to fly in thousands of paratroopers who would then cut Kosovo in half, leaving Milosevic in control of the north.
Такие планы Министерства обороны, такие предложения Министерства обороны готовило и готово было реализовать. По крайней мере, 3 аэродрома были готовы для того, чтобы в течение 2 часов залетели самолеты с десантным батальоном.
There was concern that there may be Russian aircraft inbound, and that one answer to this would be to block the runways at Pristina Airfield. And what was looked at was putting some armor tanks on the runway.
Were you in favor of that?
I believed it was an appropriate course of action.
But Clark's plan was again overruled by Britain. Instead, Clark asked neighboring countries to try to stop Russian aircraft flying towards Kosovo. The Romanian defense minister took great pleasure in warning Moscow not to try to fly over his country.
He said you could do that. Of course, we would be obliged to send an aircraft up to intercept your aircraft, and there are only 2 buttons on our aircraft, and if the pilot pushes the wrong one, he'll shoot down your transport plane with all of these people on board. Of course, that would be a crime, he said, and he would be prosecuted under our law. He'd be convicted. He would be sent to jail for 7 years. But he would also be a national hero.
June the 12th, 1999, Force Entry Day. With the agreement of Slobodan Milosevic, 50,000 NATO troops entered Yugoslavia at last. They went more in relief than in triumph. It had taken 78 days of non-stop bombing. Militarily undefeated and defiant to the last, the Serb forces who so laid waste to Kosovo pulled out unimpeded and unpunished for what they'd done. Serbs out, NATO in, refugees home.
Populates nuk I pritej, gjithkush mundoi se sa më shpejt vjen dhe të dëgjoj për vendin e vet. Ishte një tmerr I vërtet. Shtetit ende I vinte lufte, djegje, baruti.
Pravo sa groblja otišli ispeći. Ostavio mi upečatljive reči sveštenika koji je držao opelo, koji se na kraju zaplakao I rekao: Ivane, da li ćemo više ikada doći na ovaj grob da ti držimo opelo? To je zaista teško.
The Kosovo Liberation Army recruited NATO to its cause. An old injustice was defeated here, but NATO's moral war rewarded those who took up arms.
I don't believe that any of the liberation forces or guerrilla forces in our lifetime were moved more rapidly or more successfully from total obscurity to international standing and recognition than the Kosovo Liberation Army.
The Serbs that remain live in ghettos now. At Goraždevac near Peć, 600 Italians stand between them and the vengeance of their old neighbors. The war started as a moral crusade to end such intolerance. But in the end it wasn't about morality. It wasn't even about Kosovo. It was about saving NATO from collapse.
The bottom line was we couldn't lose if we lost. It's not just that we would have failed in our strategic objective, failed in terms of the moral purpose. We would have dealt a devastating blow to the credibility of NATO. And the world would have been less safe as a result of that.
And NATO's leaders did not know when they led us into it that that is what they were jeopardizing, how closely they courted catastrophe, or how hollow the moral victory would seem amid the ruins in a Kosovo where the oppressed, once liberated, themselves oppress.